I said before, my name's Claudia Edwards. I'm a therapist within ABL, and today I'm going to be talking about COVID-19, the pandemic, and its impact on our mental and physical health. So, what's on the agenda for this evening? Thank you all for joining us tonight. I know it's going to be a lovely sunny evening and we're stuck in watching this, but surely it should be interesting and you'll all have some fun. So, COVID-19, I'm sure we all know exactly what it is. But how did it affect us? So that's what we're going to look at today. We're going to look at pandemics and quarantine and what they actually do to people and how they affect people. We're going to look at our mental health in consideration of the pandemic, our physical health in consideration of the pandemic, and also how we can manage these now we are coming out of the pandemic. And again, as I use the words coming out of the pandemic in the meeting today, I know when the pandemic isn't at an end. I do realise that COVID's still around. It's just the best of the best we have at the moment, I suppose. So COVID-19, the definition of COVID-19 has been defined by the World Health Organization as an infectious disease which mainly affects the body's respiratory functions. So do you think that this is all the coronavirus affected? Because I certainly don't think that that was all coronavirus affected. It may have seemed at one point to be just the respiratory functions of the body, but when we talk about it, and especially what we're going to highlight in today's webinar, is mental health, that physical health, the world, and relationships we actually had with other people. So we're going to look at pandemics and quarantine to start with. So when researching pandemics and quarantine, we actually found that natural disasters are very similar and they have similar effects. So when we look at the effects of natural disasters on a population's well-being and quality of life, research has shown that a traumatic response may occur. So when we look at these natural disasters, these can be hurricanes, so earthquakes, floodings, wars. It creates a traumatic effect on a population's well-being, and it's been shown to be long-standing and may even create a measurable change within this population. So these changes have been shown to be a sense of a heightened anxiety, aggression levels, increasing changes to an individual's behaviour, and also the possibility of acute stress developing into a post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. You might hear PTSD a couple of times today. So depression and PTSD have been identified as the most common onset of mental health problems after a disaster. So if we look at the globally famous disaster, Hurricane Katrina, this took place in the Gulf Coast in 2005. Research showed that there was a high incidence of mental health conditions afterwards, such as a doubling of major depressive disorders, panic disorders, generalized anxiety disorders, and also this PTSD. So when we're looking at these pandemics, they've shown a similar psychological implementation. Sorry, I struggle with that word. So a pandemic refers to new disease or new diseases that have been severe, they might be quite contagious or infectious, and they spread globally. So when we look at the SARS pandemic, which is the severe acute respiratory syndrome, this began in the 21st century. Studies found that it affected individuals' increase of anxious feelings, and that stress was also present. The mental health of the people quarantining during SARS was also investigated, and they found that there was a 30% rise in depression in this PTSD. So very similar factors are coming in place from natural disasters and looking at pandemics. So whilst also exploring this quarantining of people with mental health and SARS, they found that there were lots of things coming from quarantine. And so the possible links were being quite lonely, experiencing anger, boredom, and a worry surrounding loved ones. Because, as we know from quarantine and in the pandemic, we don't really know how our loved ones do, and we can connect to them through the internet, through phones, through ringing, but we couldn't actually see them. And we know that takes a whole percentage of what we actually know about people and how they are. So they also found that people's individual daily life and well-being during this time was majorly affected. And they found that people experienced a collective decline in future security. So this feeling of being a part of society, a general standard of living, and intimate relationships. This alludes that a pandemic can push mental health to an extreme, so that it is shown to be affecting an individual's life of fulfillment and well-being. So as we all know, quarantining is a measure that separates a possibly contagious person from the public to avoid more spreading of diseases. Now, whether or not we think that works, it's a process that probably the whole world went through at 1.2 years ago. So it's a crucial measure we do use in the pandemics to decrease the spread of infections. And any kind of a quarantine experience during the lockdown correlated strongly with depressive symptoms. And the biggest problem in lockdown in the United Kingdom was researched to be the loss of normality and social freedom. So these losses were shown in implementation of social distancing, the cancelling of gatherings, cancelling of events, massive travel restrictions around the UK, and closing of schools and workplaces. So these things we'll always come back to throughout this presentation today. With the loss of normality and social freedom, these implications may also lead to the development of loneliness during lockdown, which I think we can all agree that we saw quite a lot of during the lockdown, whether it was through yourself or through your family members. So the last section we want to talk about with the pandemic and the quarantine today is a thing called contagion. So contagion is a psychological effect. It produces to be found in individually, but also a collective. So it's known as the spread of disease from one person to another, but it's also a theory of behavior, which explains how a collective can cause an impact on actions and emotions. So containing contagion, which is a funny phrase to say, affects a collective society by altering emotions and actions that encourages an individual's safety to feel threatened in a communal environment. So this occurs by separating a community from its usual order. And when we're in the midst of the pandemic in the United Kingdom, we saw this happen in many ways. So the changes in emotions were shown to be maybe overcrowding of hospitals, panic shopping. We all saw that there was basically no toilet paper or flour or, baking supplies for months, it seemed like. Mass evacuations, heightened sense of anxiety about leaving the house, ignoring advice from public health measures, and this increased loneliness. Now, I know we are all part of this pandemic and we all experience it in different ways, but these are the main themes I'm going to be talking about today. I understand that everybody's experience of the pandemic was very individual, and I'm not trying to take away that individual from anyone. I'm just trying to show what we found from research. So throughout this PowerPoint today, I'm going to be talking about well-being, and well-being in a sense of the COVID-19 and also physical health and lifestyle and mental health. So there is no consensus around a single definition of what well-being is, but there is a general agreement that a minimum well-being includes the presence of positive emotions and moods. So, for example, contentment and happiness, and the absence of negative emotions. For example, depression and anxiety. It's not saying that you can't have them emotions, but what it's saying is that the positive outweighs the bad on the majority of days. So it also looks at satisfaction and life fulfillment and positive functioning. So there are several aspects of well-being that we can look at, and these are physical well-being, economic well-being, social well-being, developmental and activity well-being, emotional well-being, psychological well-being, and the last one, engaging in activities and anything like that. So what did the coronavirus affect? So I asked this question before, and this is very biased of me because it's in my own experience of what I do believe coronavirus has affected. So each bubble is showing what I think the coronavirus affected. If you have any more ideas, please feel free to put them in the chat. Or if you have any more experiences you felt, please feel free to say that. So firstly, I think it affected mental health. Now, if I talk about every single aspect of mental health that the coronavirus affected, I might be here for more than an hour. So I'm just going to focus on the three main ones I found in my research. So that's depression, stress, and anxiety. There was also physical health, so no exercise. There was also that sociability. We weren't able to leave the house. We were quite lonely, especially for those people who lived alone or had to move back in with family, or, maybe the people who were at school or university without the kind of loved ones around them. And again, that ties into not being able to see these loved ones, like grandparents, people in care, people in hospital. The big one that no one really talks about with coronavirus is the long COVID. It's what we got. We might not have just got COVID, but there's now people experiencing really long COVID where you're feeling quite tired, quite achy, and it's a completely changed, different lifestyle. COVID also affected education. I know myself, I was in university around the COVID time, and it really affected myself. Everything moved online. It was all shock all of a sudden. And I know a lot of people had no education. They had to homeschool their kids, which adds extra stress and extra pressure. And then the kids who were being homeschooled, maybe they had a loss of interest because working from home, I will talk about that in a second, and that lack of motivation. And then in a work style as well. So there's that worry of future with what work holds, and also maybe loss of jobs and financial worries. And something I didn't mention with work is that working from home. People don't realise, but working from home added a lot of stress and anxiety to ourselves. And I'll talk about that in a little more detail later on. So we're going to talk about mental health. And as I said before, I'm going to focus on stress, anxiety, and depression today. So again, if I spoke about everything that the COVID, the pandemic did affect, would be here all day. So these three are the most important. They're very interlinked. If everyone's probably experienced some aspects of stress, anxiety, and depression. And as you know, symptoms are very similar. So what we're going to discuss on this slide is each of them in particular, and the mental, physical, and behavioral symptoms that they all have. So stress is our body's response to pressure, and many different situations or life events can cause stress. For example, a pandemic. It is often triggered when we experience something new, unexpected, or that threatens our sense of self. We often feel it maybe when we have little control over a situation. So what are the signs of this stress? We all know we've probably seen stress in many different ways in ourselves. It might be individual in different people. But when you experience stress, you may feel anxious. You may feel afraid, quite angry, quite sad or irritable. And you might get quite frustrated or depressed. And this can affect our bodies in the same way. So that's how we're feeling mentally, but our bodies also react in a number of ways, including headaches. We could have some migraines, nausea, indigestion, and digestive problems such as constipation, bloating, diarrhea, or maybe some symptoms of IBS. I know it's very common with stress or anxiety. IBS is quite a present factor in there as well. So that could also be shallow breathing or hyperventilating. You could start sweating or having heart palpitations, and also experience aches and pains. Stress, make sure it tells the whole body that we're feeling this way. It feels quite run down. And we may behave quite differently when we're stressed. We may withdraw from other people. I know if I'm stressed, maybe pulling that duvet over my head and getting into bed and, turning off my phone for a while. We may snap at people, if it's been a long day at work and someone asks you a question, kids coming home and saying, oh, what's for tea? The last thing you want to think about is making tea, never mind having to go through and cook it as well. So I can understand, that snappiness. It could also cause you to be quite indecisive and be quite tearful. Could affect your sleep in many ways, whether that's affecting going to sleep or maybe staying asleep. And it could also lead people to smoke, drink, or take more drugs. It affects us in many ways, and that might be a way of people coping. So next is anxiety. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about anxiety in the next slide. Not the next slide, the next one. But later on, I'll talk a bit more about anxiety and the processes and the pathways to anxiety because I think it's really interesting. But we're just going to talk about anxiety as a whole right now. So anxiety is a feeling of unease, worry, or fear. It is normal to feel quite anxious sometimes, as it is how we respond to the feeling of being frightened or under pressure or stressed. Again, as I said, they're all really interlinked together. So anxiety isn't necessarily a bad thing. When we talk about anxiety, people quite have that stigma of it being quite bad, when it can really spare us. It can help us stay alert. It can make us aware of risks and motivate us to solve problems. However, anxiety can be a problem if it's affecting your ability to live your life. So if it gets into that where it's every day and it's kind of making you feel quite down. Anxiety can affect your concentrating. So I know when I'm anxious, sometimes you've got thoughts that are going and you can't really concentrate on one thing. And that can make you quite irritable again. It can also make you feel quite detached from yourself and the world around you. The physical symptoms of anxiety can be quite inducing as well. So it's not only that panic attack that we talk about with these physical symptoms, but it's also that restlessness that can't sit still, that leg shaking, having to tap something. It can be that feeling dizzy or lightheaded. Then we talk about wobbly legs, pains, pins and needles in hands and feet. And then we go into like these panic attack symptoms, so that shortness of breath, hyperventilating, the heart palpitations, the nausea, maybe needing the toilet more or less. So that's how anxiety can present ourselves in the body. So if you get these feelings in the mind brain racing, it might be this anxiety coming to tell you that it's here. Anxiety can also affect your behavior. You may withdraw from your friends and your family, and you may feel that you're unable to go to work, or maybe unable to go to school, or you might even avoid certain places. And while avoiding these certain places can give you short-term relief, the anxiety may often return. And next time you're in the situation, avoiding it only reinforces the danger and never gives you a chance to figure out this truth. But we'll talk a little bit more about that in the anxiety slide, the pathway slide. So we all have times when we feel down, but depression is about more of a feeling of being sad and fed up. For a few days, depression causes a low mood that lasts quite a long time and can affect daily life and well-being. So mild depression can make you feel low, as if everything is harder to do. And quite severe depression can lead to a hopelessness feeling. And in some cases, it can lead you to feeling quite suicidal. So if you're not depressed and you haven't felt this before, you've probably felt bouts of sadness before, but maybe nothing quite like a depressive episode. And it's okay that if you have experienced depression, because 1 in 3 in 100 people at one point in the UK do experience depressive feelings. And I think it's 8 in 100 people also experience episodes of depression and anxiety at one time. So it's a welcoming and common factor, but it's okay. It's okay to feel like that, and it's okay to talk about things like that, especially when later on we're going to talk about in respect to the pandemic and how that affected our depression. So depression affects us in many ways. It makes us feel quite sad. It makes us feel quite empty. It does make us feel quite guilty, maybe worthless. Again, that restless or irritable kind of feeling, and maybe the opposite, feeling quite empty or numb. Depression can also factor in with our lack of confidence or self-esteem. It can kind of vary between the two of trying to beat us down and kind of keep us in and keep us away from people. It can also make us quite suicidal and feel like we need to hurt ourselves. And this can go through to physical symptoms. So when we feel quite depressed, we can feel quite tired. We can feel a lack of energy, or moving or speaking quite slowly. We can have sleep problems where we find it hard to get to sleep, or we're waking up really early and not really getting an effective amount of sleep. And we can also have changes in our weight and our appetite. We can either, quite encourage that kind of eating to get that emotion to not feel that numb anymore, or we can go the opposite where we don't eat. We kind of have periods where when we're in our depression, we kind of stay away from food, and it's that all or nothing maybe behavior. And we can also feel like we have unexplained aches or pains in our body. We also might behave differently when we experience depression, and we may avoid other people. So we may stay at home a bit more. We may even avoid family or close friends, and we might find it hard to function in work or school or college. So we may avoid going to them places. And it might be difficult for us to make decisions or think clearly. And this can affect our concentration and our memory. And that can also tie in with that sleep. So we're going to talk about stress first, and how did the pandemic affect stress? So the first thing we're going to talk about is bereavement. And the pandemic, it really opened our eyes to loss and how effective loss can be, not just in our individual lives, but over our country, over the world. I know, looking at it, that from my point of view, when it was the pandemic, it was quite distressing. It stressed me out. If you're anything like me, I was looking at, I was getting myself quite anxious about it, looking at the daily death toll, kind of getting myself in that moment. And if there's anything you kind of went through like that, I understand, because the more we didn't want to know, the more we tried to find out about it. We also got stressed, and we experienced stress in the pandemic from losing jobs. So suddenly, our jobs were very safe, were very secure. And especially people in hospitality, we were told, the next minute we didn't have a job. We were, not able to go to work. We weren't able to experience our, as we talked about before, our daily life or our well-being was kind of affected by losing our jobs. And it got people quite a lot of stress, thinking of what was our future going to look like without a job, or what was our security like without these jobs. And I think that went down to the unexpected money problems as well. I know furlough was quite traumatic for a lot of people, and even the discussion of money, maybe keeping mortgages, paying rent, it stressed a lot of people out, and making that kind of experience a little bit more stressful. You've got a pandemic and you're adding on top extra money cut, losing jobs. So I said before we were going to talk about work-related stress. So we're going to talk about working from home. So when we were working from home, we look at our environment at work. So say, for example, we work in an office. When we go to that office, that's where our work begins. And then when we get in our car and we drive home, maybe that's when our work ends. We get to leave our work at home. I know it's slightly different for certain jobs. For example, nurses, them jobs you can't really ever leave at work. You take them home with you. But if we stick to this office job, for example, we could leave the office and come home, and that was a different life. And when workplaces started taking our laptops and stuff into the home, so we can work from home now, I know that did affect a lot of people. They could work from the kitchen, they could work from the bedroom, they could work from their office, they could work from the living room. And if you think about it, each of these rooms has a function in our homes, in our places that we live. So the kitchen, it's a place of food, it's a place of cooking. The living room may be a place of entertainment, maybe a place to relax with family. The office, that might be for doing things like, online shopping, or maybe sorting out bills and stuff like that. And then the bedroom, that's a place of relax, of sleep, of rest. So when we brought our workplaces into them, people are finding it hard to kind of turn off from this. So that stress was being increased. And then health conditions. I've added health conditions because people who were told they were high risk, they were told to stay at home. That stress was even more. What if, they caught it? I know for a long time, we didn't know it was an airborne disease. So I was at home thinking, oh, what if I don't even go out and it could catch COVID? We were very much in the known. We were confused. We weren't really told much about it. And people with health conditions really struggled with that, that stress, the added stress on it, already you're being taken away from hospitals. You can't go to the hospitals or doctors anymore. But now, there's this life-threatening infection that's out there now that could get you. So how can we help ourselves with stress? So the first, as you can see, there's quite a lot of ways you can help yourself with stress. So if you want to read through them, that's fine. I'm going to talk about this first one. And I will do this with the other slides. I'm just going to talk about one because, again, if I spoke about them all, I'd be here all evening. So the first one, recognize where this stress is stemming from. So we can firstly recognize where this stress is coming from and where it is a problem. So it is important to connect to the physical and the emotional signs you're experiencing, to the pressures of stress. So don't ignore the physical warning signs such as tense muscles, tiredness, headaches, or migraines. Think about what is causing your stress and sort them into issues with a practical set of solutions. So things that will get better over time, or things that you can't do anything about, so you've got no control over, and maybe take small steps towards the things that you can improve, and make a plan to address these things that you can. And this might involve setting yourself realistic expectations and prioritizing essential commitments. And if you do feel overwhelmed, it's okay to ask for help, and it's okay to say no to things you can't take on. For example, we're here in this webinar right now and you're learning about things, and I think that's a really good way to start, whether you have been feeling stressed or anxious or anything we're going to talk about. So next, we're going to talk about anxiety. So this one there's quite a lot to this one, and that's because I like to talk about the two different pathways of anxiety. It's a bit of psychoeducation, and I think afterwards we'll talk about how the pandemic affected our anxieties. So firstly, we're going to talk about the amygdala-based anxiety. So the amygdala is two almond-shaped structures on either side of the brain. And if your anxiety appears from nowhere and there's no really logical reason to why you're experiencing it, you can probably thank your amygdala for this. So the amygdala creates aspects of anxiety outside of our conscious knowledge or control. So in less than a tenth of a second, it provides the means for adrenaline and could increase in heart rate and blood pressure, and all the perspiration and the muscular tension and the nausea we feel with anxiety can stem from this amygdala. So what it does is the amygdala acts like a guard. It really wants to protect us, and it keeps us alive by the action of checking out and responding to potential threats. The old amygdala hasn't really caught up with our day-to-day lives that are normal now. It's still in the prehistoric with our ancestors. So it's still, you might have heard of fight, flight, or freeze. So what that is in the olden days, well, I say the olden days, probably way, way, way back, when our ancestors were presented with a problem. So, for example, a bear was in front of them. They either were about to fight or they're about to run from the situation. So what the amygdala does is, when it reacts to like a threatening response, it prepares our body for that fight or flight by sending all these physical symptoms. So that is that rush of adrenaline or the rush of cortisol down our bodies. So we are able to carry on. So we were able to fight, maybe not experience pain in that moment. It's a really clever thing, and it is quite cool talking about amygdala-based anxiety. So most people can easily recall situations where they've ever reacted instinctively to a situation, or even just perceived a threat from a sound, for example, a popping balloon, or a shape or a shadow. And it can sometimes leave us feeling a bit embarrassed. But that same mechanism is probably, what spurred us from injury or worse in the past. And many of the worst aspects of panic, so when we talk about panic, we relate with anxiety, are due to the activation of the amygdala. And this could be stomach upsets, the pounding heart, hyperventilation, and the trembling. And this is because the amygdala attempts to prepare us for this fight or flight. So brains are hardwired to allow the amygdala to take over in certain situations. And it may not always be convenient or helpful, but the design of the brain is old and it still operates on the basis of assuming it's intimate and sudden dangers. So when we talk about cortex-based anxiety, and this is one of the most interesting anxiety pathways, I believe, it's the cerebral cortex. So what this is, it's the squiggly outer grey area of the brain. So when you're growing a brain, when you're a child, you normally just do loads of squiggles. That's basically what that area is. So all our abilities to process sensations, our thoughts, imaginations, memories, logic, and planning are all located there. So it's quite jam-packed. It's got quite a lot of jobs to do. But that's not all. It can also add meanings to these. So the meanings we attach to these sensations. So the things we hear, we feel, we smell, we touch, which are associated to the functions of the cerebral cortex. So a brain allows us to imagine the future. And so we are able to kind of envision any number of negative outcomes. It is our very ability to interpret and anticipate and form images in our mind that creates anxiety when no actual threat exists. So the process is called cognitive fusion. So cognitive fusion is the linking of thoughts to experiences, and it is the result of this cognitive fusion. So an example of this may be the belief. So a thought of going into a shop, and when you go into the shop, you're going to have a panic attack. So that's the experience. And our thoughts are likely to activate the second pathway, so this amygdala-based pathway. So that gives us rise to the uncomfortable physical sensations associated with anxiety. So the experiences of like a panic attack. And what that does is cognitive fusion occurs and we misinterpret facts. For example, your thoughts scare you, and that kind of we interpret the thoughts about we're going to have a panic attack with facts because our brains prepared it to happen. So that reestablishes our anxiety. And what this does is it creates pathways that are quite strong. So, for example, for a pathway that we keep rehearsing or we keep saying to, this could be, I'm not very good at that, or I'm not good at this. The more we keep saying that, the more we're going to believe it, and we're going to think that thought is in fact a fact. So if we look at these two anxiety pathways, we can understand why the pandemic caused so much anxiety to rise within the population. Our brains are therefore assuming the worst. For example, is the pandemic going to get any worse? What happens if it gets any worse? Can it get any worse? You know, all the questions we had going through our head when it was that March and the lockdown day happened. And if you're anything like me, as I said before, I was increasing that anxiety by looking at that daily death toll. And as to why that was available to public, I still don't know to this day. But it increased my own anxieties as I was able to see it. And then my brain read that information and made it worse. So for what it was reading, it amplified it by 10. So to take control of our anxiety, we must break them down again into the two pathways. So taking control of our amygdala-based anxiety is about combating all the physical symptoms. So firstly, the breathing, focuses, strategies. So that is involving things such as slow, deep breathing exercises. You can find these on Headspace, on YouTube. They're really beneficial for actually paying attention to and focusing, especially if you are getting this hyperventilation feeling. There's also diaphragmatic, I never know if I say that word right, but that's basically belly breathing, and it involves fully engaging with the stomach and the abdominal muscles and the diaphragm when breathing. And this means pulling the diaphragm down, with each breath. And in this way, it'll help the lungs fill more effectively and hopefully catch the anxious breath that the anxiety has caused. There's also muscle focused relaxation strategies. So these are doing muscle tension inventories. So for example, I like to do like a body scan, and I start from my toes and I squeeze my toes and really tense them, and then I release them. And I do that by working up from my toes to my nose. And that can involve scrunching up your nose, get it really tense, and then releasing it. And that it revolves like relaxing your whole body. I usually do this before bed. It's a really good process to kind of help you out. And combining that with breathing exercises can get you in for a better sleep, especially if, bedtime is your anxious thoughts time. Another way we can help with anxiety is looking at imagery. So this may be putting a playlist on YouTube or maybe on the Headspace app, which I mentioned before, which is really good. And they talk you through a guided imagery of maybe being on a warm beach or at your favorite place. And with that imagination, you are settling in and imagining and relaxing that you are there. And the other process to help with anxiety are meditation, breath focus meditation, exercise and sleep. So then we talk about cortex-based anxiety. So when we're focusing on cortex-based anxiety, the first thing we can do to help is develop a healthy skepticism about our cortex. One thing I have to say about this is that thoughts are not facts, and some of our thoughts may seem like facts, and they may try and present them in a way where this is true, but in reality, we must prove it to be true or not. So we must really analyze that. So that's why being quite skeptic of what our brain does present us with. Another way we can cope is using coping thoughts, so healthy coping thoughts. So for example, an anxiety-inducing thought might be, as I said before, it's no use trying because there's no way this is going to work out for me. So a coping thought to replace that kind of anxiety-inducing thought may be, I'm going to try because then there's at least a chance I'll accomplish something. So what that does in our cortex is the more we say that, coping thought, it'll replace that anxious thought. And what we'll do is actually over time, we'll slowly begin to replace these anxious thoughts with ones to cope. So depression, again, so we talked about depression before, when we link it to the pandemic, so it was when we're experiencing this depressive feelings, we said before, it's quite easy to not want to see any people or quite easy to not talk to anyone, feel quite numb. And I think that's one way I would describe the pandemic in all, is quite numb. And it made it easier to kind of feel these depressive symptoms because it was easier to avoid people at that time. There was nothing really to be motivated for. There was a lot of change to our daily life, our well-being, our usual routine. And again, working from home made it really hard to function. So I've listed a lot of places here of what we can help ourselves do with depression. So we can get support from GPs, CBT, medication, finding things you enjoy and filling your life with them. For example, you might have a Grease sing-along night, where you do old-fashioned movies. You might really like Disney films, watch a Disney film. There's lots of things that we can fulfill ourselves in our lives with things that we enjoy. And again, I've mentioned that Headspace down there. And if you don't get anything from out of the day, maybe remembering the name of the app might do good. So now we're going to talk about physical health. So physical health can refer to a person's physical activity level, our diet, our nutrition, our sleep cycle, and level of consumption of alcohol and drugs. So when we're going to look at this with the pandemic, so I'm going to use motivation to describe the pandemic and its effects on our physical health, because as I said before, our motivation was lost completely with our change of routine, our change of plans, our change of daily life, basically. When that happens, it can really alter our motivation. So there's two types of motivation. So there is extrinsic motivation, and this is the motivation we look at when we think of exercise. So it includes completing a task to avoid a punishment or to receive a reward. So For example, I'm going to work out so I look good in a bikini on holiday. And this motivation can be kind of damaging, as you're not necessarily exercising because you would enjoy something, or you're not really doing something because you enjoy doing it. You're just doing it for a certain goal at the end of it. And what that does is over time, where, for example, if we keep it on this like exercise point of view, if we keep exercising and we don't really see that effects taking place or the results, we tend to give up because we're not really getting that immediate response and immediate goal. So then we look at intrinsic motivation, and this motivation comes from within. It's something which is specific and important to yourself, but not to some future goal. So this can be exercising because it feels good, working out to relieve stress, enjoying exercise as it gives you time to yourself. For example, if I was to go to the gym, I wouldn't do cardio. I'd do something I enjoy, like weightlifting, because it's something I get a sense of achievement out of or accomplishment. And that's what I really enjoy. So how did COVID-19 affect our motivation? So we had a bit of a sedentary lifestyle. We were being forced. So some of us changed from maybe going to the gym 3 times a week to then not being able to go at all because it was closed. Or some of us went from being in our going into work and socializing and being able to make plans for people. Maybe you were going to go for a walk in the park or hike at a weekend or do something really enjoyable for everyone involved. So us not being allowed to leave our house or not being allowed to leave our rooms. And I think it's still funny now where I think back to the times where we were allowed a 30-minute slot outside of our own experiences. And if you think about it, a lot of people out there might not have had back gardens or a space, to leave the house in. They might have been in a flat, and there's not much area in a flat or in a small house. They don't have a back garden. There's not much place to explore or go out in. And then there was also that stress. So a lot of this mental health coincides with the physical health and this motivation. There was no access to the workout facilities. It might have been that disliking of exercise and also boredom. When you're bored, the last thing you want to do is go out and exercise. So there was a few mental barriers to physical health. So there's this fear. Exercise can be scary, especially when it's something you haven't done before. There's a confusion. How much exercise do you need and how do we fit it all in? There's almost that pain and suffering because exercise is a source of physical exertion and it can cause some discomfort and it can feel more like pain and suffering. As I said before, there's that boredom. So there are plenty of exercises out there and sometimes they can be quite boring and repetitive. And then there's frustration. So many people work out to lose weight, but that process is quite slow. So getting the motivation to continue to help our physical health now, coming out of the pandemic. So first one, make it easy to exercise. What I like to do, I look at Pinterest. I educate myself on what exercises are out there, what's going to help what. I maybe look at what area I need to work on and maybe what exercise is going to help for that, what nutritional value is going to help for that, and what kind of change in my diet do I need to help that. Also gather supplies you need before working out. The worst thing I've ever done is go to the gym without a water bottle and then realize that, you don't want to drink from the water fountain. You may be embarrassed because you need to go buy one or something like that. Or maybe you've not come with a towel when you know you're going to quite sweat. Or maybe you come in the wrong clothing. It's just exploring what's comfortable for you and knowing what you need for that space. There's also find something you like to do and experiment with it. So I always say walking is a really good place to start. If you like walking, you may be able then to move that on to something else. So try a few things. The first few things you might try might not be for you, but if you keep trying certain things, you might really enjoy it. And give yourself permission to be good at something. Allow yourself to get to know yourself a little bit better. And even if it is, accepting when you do fail at something or accepting that you're not good at something, by doing that, you're able to move forward with it. And as I say, belief in yourself is the best motivation. It's looking at that intrinsic motivation. It's focusing on you and what you enjoy. Get some encouragement, someone to support you and encourage you. So maybe get a workout buddy or listen to an empowering podcast. So something that will really make you feel pumped up, or maybe if you really like music that makes you feel empowered. Disney hits sing along. I would love it in the gym, singing along, belting my heart out. Reward yourself. So listen to what you need. If you have, ate really healthily, or you've been having meals which are really nutritional, and one night you feel like, oh, I really fancy, maybe a chocolate cake or a little slice of a cake or biscuits. Allow yourself to have that. Be gentle with yourself. We're only people at the end of the day, and we're trying our best out there, and make sure whatever your best is good enough for yourself. And plan your rewards. So make them bigger each month, or each achievement you've done something. It might be having a bath, having a night to yourself, allowing to take that minute out. And lastly, get some help. I mean, talk to someone. You've got a HLA, a trainer, or a therapist. And lastly, you're here. So that's the biggest start. And just to finish off today's PowerPoint, I'm just going to finish with my favorite quote. So the curious paradox is that when I accept myself just as I am, then I can change. And what this means is try to accept who you are today, and perhaps maybe the next day and the next day. And if you drop that resistance and the negativity and see what opportunities arise naturally, when you've got that clear brain, that clear present moment, you're living in that positive, and you may be feeling a bit more confident, then maybe change will come easier. But thank you. And do you have any questions?